The first shot rang out over the Aspen saloon just as Wyatt Grimes drained his whiskey. The acrid burn in his throat a welcome distraction from the cold emptiness that had become his constant companion. The year was 1875, and Colorado Territory was no place for the soft-hearted, a fact Wyatt had learned through years of hard living that had calcified his soul like the rocky terrain surrounding the small mining town. "Damn it all," he muttered, sliding from his barstool as more gunfire erupted outside. Another day, another fight that wasn't his business. That's how he'd survive this long, keeping to himself and riding away from trouble whenever possible. The bartender ducked behind his counter. "Wyatt, you'd best get down." But Wyatt simply dropped a coin on the bar and headed for the back door. At 32, he'd outlived most men of his profession by keeping his head down and his guns holstered unless absolutely necessary. A gunslinger turned bounty hunter, he'd developed a reputation for bringing in his targets alive not out of mercy, but because dead men didn't pay as well. He'd nearly made it to the door when it burst open, revealing a woman with wild, honey-colored hair and desperate eyes. Blood stained her sleeve and she clutched a small leather pouch to her chest. "Please," she gasped, stumbling forward. "They're going to kill me." Wyatt's first instinct was to step aside. Her problems weren't his concern, but something in her voice gave him pause. Fear, yes, but determination too. "Not my fight, madam," he said, tipping his hat to move past her. Her hand shot out, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "I can pay you. I need protection until the stage comes tomorrow." Outside, men's voices grew louder, calling a name he couldn't quite make out. "Whatever you've done." "I haven't done anything," she interrupted, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "They murdered my father for his claim. I'm the only witness." Wyatt studied her face, the exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath her eyes, but there was a fierceness there too. Truth or lie, he couldn't tell, but the approaching voices made the decision for him. "Backstairs," he muttered, nodding toward a narrow doorway. "Quick and quiet." Relief flooded her features as she followed him through the door and up the cramped stairwell that led to the rooms above. Wyatt moved silently, years of tracking making his footsteps ghost-like despite his tall frame and the weight of the guns at his hips. At the top of the stairs, he led her down a narrow hallway to the last door, producing a key from his pocket. "Get inside," he instructed, glancing back toward the stairs as boots thundered on the saloon floor below. Once inside the sparsely furnished room, the woman sagged against the wall, her breath coming in short gasps. Blood had soaked through her sleeve, spreading across the fabric of her simple blue dress. "Let me see that arm," Wyatt said, reaching for his saddlebag where he kept a small medical kit. "It's just a graze," she replied, though the pallor of her face suggested otherwise. "Thank you for helping me." "You didn't have to." Wyatt's hands stilled for a moment. Her gratitude, delivered with such sincerity, made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being thanked not like that, like what he'd done was something special, something worthy. "Don't thank me yet," he muttered, pulling out a bottle of whiskey and some clean cloth. "Those men still want whatever you've got, and they'll tear this town apart looking for it." She straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze directly. "My name is Julia Owens. My father was Marcus Owens. He had a gold claim north of here, and these men," her voice caught, but she pressed on. "They killed him in cold blood when he refused to sell. I have the deed and his journal detailing their threats." Wyatt soaked a cloth in whiskey. "This will hurt," he warned before pressing it to her wound. To her credit, she barely flinched. "Why not go to the sheriff?" A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Sheriff Holloway, he's in their pocket. He's the one who shot at me when I tried to report what happened." That explained the blood. Wyatt had his doubts about Holloway. The man wore a badge but had the eyes of someone who'd sold his soul long ago. "So what's your plan?" "The stage won't come till tomorrow afternoon, assuming it's not delayed." "I need to get to Denver," Julia said. "My father's lawyer has copies of all the documentation. Once I show him what's happened and give him my father's journal." She trailed off, her eyes meeting his. "I just need to survive until then." Wyatt finished bandaging her arm in silence. He'd planned to leave Aspen in the morning, heading south toward Durango for a bounty that promised good money. Getting involved in a land dispute with corrupt lawmen was the opposite of keeping a low profile. "I can pay you," she said again, reaching for the pouch at her waist. "I have money." "Keep it," Wyatt replied, standing to check the window. The street below was filling with men, some he recognized as the sheriff's deputies, others as hired guns who worked for Elias Thornton, the man buying up all the mining claims in the area. "You'll need it if you make it to Denver." "When?" she corrected firmly. "When I make it to Denver." The determination in her voice stirred something in him, an echo of who he might have been before life hardened him, before he lost his family to a raid, before he learned that survival meant looking out for himself and no one else. "Get some rest," he said, gesturing to the narrow bed. "I'll keep watch. At dawn, we'll figure out how to get you on that stage without getting shot." Julia hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Grimes, Wyatt Grimes." "Thank you, Mr. Grimes," she said again, that same reverence in her voice that made something twist in his chest. "You've saved my life." Wyatt turned away, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Don't thank me yet, Miss Owens. We're a long way from safe." As Julia settled on the bed, Wyatt took up position by the window, his mind working through possible escape routes. The town of Aspen was still new, built around the silver mines that had drawn prospectors and opportunists alike to the Colorado mountains. It wasn't large, but it offered enough hiding places if one knew where to look, and Wyatt did. He'd spent 3 months here, longer than he usually stayed anywhere, taking bounty work and keeping to himself. He knew the back alleys, the stable entrances, the ways in and out that most folks overlooked. Below, Sheriff Holloway's voice carried up to the window. "Spread out. The Owens woman couldn't have gotten far. $500 to the man who finds her." Wyatt glanced at Julia, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep, her face finally peaceful despite the danger. Something about her stirred memories he'd long buried of his sister Emily, who'd had the same determination, the same fire. Emily, who died 10 years ago in the raid that took his parents too. He turned back to the window, his jaw set. He'd help this woman get to safety and then he'd move on. That's what he did. That's all he did. But as moonlight spilled across the room, highlighting the steady rise and fall of Julia's chest, Wyatt couldn't ignore the unfamiliar feeling taking root in him, something dangerously close to caring what happened to someone other than himself. Dawn broke with a tentative pink light that filtered through the thin curtains of Wyatt's room. He hadn't slept, keeping vigil through the night as search parties crisscrossed the town below. Julia had woken once, her face tense with pain, and he'd given her laudanum from his kit to help her rest. The bullet graze wasn't deep, but it needed time to heal, time they didn't have. She stirred now, her eyes opening slowly, confusion crossing her features before recognition set in. "It wasn't a dream then," she murmured, sitting up carefully. "Afraid not," Wyatt replied, offering her a canteen of water. "How's the arm?" Julia tested it, wincing slightly. "It'll do." She took a sip of water, then asked, "Have they gone?" "Not exactly. Sheriff's got men watching the stage office and the main roads out of town. Thornton's men are checking the boarding houses and saloons." Fear flashed in her eyes, but she quickly masked it. "Then we need another way out." Wyatt nodded, impressed despite himself. "Most women, most people would be in hysterics by now. I have a horse in the livery stable. If we can get to it without being seen, we could head for the next town over Carbondale. You could catch the stage there." "That would work," she agreed, getting to her feet. She smoothed her skirt, now wrinkled and stained with blood and dirt. "Though I doubt I'll go unnoticed looking like this." Wyatt considered this. "I might have a solution for that. Wait here." He slipped out of the room, moving silently down the back stairs that led to the alley behind the saloon. The town was beginning to wake, but the morning mist provided some cover as he made his way to a small laundry run by a Chinese family who had always been fair in their dealings with him. Mr. Chen looked up as Wyatt entered. surprise evident on his weathered face. "Mr. Grimes," he greeted cautiously, "you are early today." "Need a favor, Mr. Chen," Wyatt said quietly, placing a gold coin on the counter. "A dress and coat clean, something simple." The older man's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded, taking the coin. "For a lady friend, yes." "What size?" Wyatt described Julia's height and build as best he could. Mr. Chen disappeared into the back room, returning moments later with a modest gray dress and a dark blue coat. "My wife says this will fit your friend, and," he added, bringing out a bonnet, "this will help hide her face." Wyatt added another coin to the counter. "Much obliged. I'd appreciate if anyone asks. No one has been here," Mr. Chen finished with a slight bow. "Good luck, Mr. Grimes." Returning to the room, Wyatt found Julia pacing, her father's journal clutched in her hands. She looked up sharply when he entered. "Here," he said, handing her the bundle. "Change into these, the bonnet will help shield your face." Julia took the clothes, genuine surprise in her expression. "Thank you, this was thoughtful." Wyatt turned away, uncomfortable again with her gratitude. "It's practical, nothing more. You'll attract less attention." While she changed behind a wooden screen in the corner, Wyatt outlined his plan. "The livery is 3 blocks from here. The morning stage is due in an hour, which means most eyes will be on the stage office. If we time it right, we can get to my horse and be out of town before they realize you're gone." "And if we're seen?" Julia asked, emerging from behind the screen. Wyatt turned, and for a moment, words failed him. The simple dress suited her, highlighting the honey gold of her hair, which she'd pinned neatly beneath the bonnet. She looked like any respectable woman you might pass on the street, except for the intelligence in her eyes and the determined set of her jaw. "If we're seen," he finally said, "stay behind me and be ready to run. I can handle most of what they'll throw at us, but I'd rather avoid shooting if possible." Julia nodded, tucking her father's journal and the deed securely into an inner pocket of the coat. "I'm ready." They left through the back stairs, Wyatt leading the way through alleys still shrouded in morning mist. Twice they had to duck into doorways as search parties passed, but the town's attention was indeed focused on the stage office, where a crowd had gathered to await the morning coach. The livery stable was quiet when they arrived, only the stable boy dozing in the corner. Wyatt pressed a coin into the boy's hand. "Never saw us," he murmured, and the boy nodded sleepily, pocketing the money without question. Wyatt's horse, a sturdy black gelding named Midnight, nickered softly in recognition as he approached. The horse was already saddled. Wyatt had paid extra for the livery to keep him ready to ride at all times, a habit that had saved his life more than once. "Can you ride?" he asked Julia, who was eyeing the horse with trepidation. "Yes, though it's been some time," she admitted. "You'll ride with me," Wyatt decided, leading Midnight out through the back of the stable. "Hold on tight and keep your head down." He helped her mount, then swung up behind her, one arm securely around her waist as he took the reins. The warmth of her pressed against him was distracting, but he pushed the thought aside as they emerged onto a side street. They had almost reached the edge of town when a shout went up behind them. "There, that's her with Grimes." Wyatt didn't look back, instead spurring Midnight to a gallop. Gunshots cracked behind them, bullets whistling past, but they were already picking up speed, the buildings of Aspen falling away as they raced toward the tree line. Julia clung to him, her body tense but steady as they rode. Once they reached the shelter of the pines, Wyatt slowed Midnight to a more sustainable pace, listening for pursuit. "I think we lost them for now," he said, "but they'll follow. Sheriff knows these mountains." "So do you, I'd wager," Julia replied, her voice steady despite their narrow escape. Wyatt didn't answer directly, instead saying, "There's a trail ahead that follows a creek. We'll take that for a while, then cut across to higher ground where we can see anyone coming." They rode in silence for some time, the only sounds the steady rhythm of Midnight's hooves and the rushing of the creek beside them. The morning sun strengthened, burning off the mist and illuminating the spectacular beauty of the Colorado mountains rising around them. "It's beautiful," Julia said softly, almost to herself. Even now, with everything, I can see why my father loved it here. Something in her voice made Wyatt glance down at her profile, catching a glimpse of grief behind her determined expression. Your father was a miner. He asked, surprising himself with the question. He didn't usually care about the stories of others. Julia nodded. He came for the silver rush 5 years ago. He was an engineer before that in Pennsylvania. He knew what to look for, how to test the ore. His claim was starting to produce well when Thornton approached him. Thornton's buying up all the smaller claims, Wyatt commented. Been doing it for a year now. Yes, but my father wouldn't sell. He said the vein he found was worth 10 times what Thornton offered. Her voice hardened. 3 days later, Thornton's men came with the sheriff. They said they were serving papers that the claim had been legally transferred. When my father protested, showed them the deed. She trailed off, then continued quietly. Sheriff Holloway shot him, said he was resisting arrest. Wyatt felt her shoulders tense beneath his arm. I was there, hiding in the cabin. I heard everything, saw everything. When they left, I took his journal and the deed and ran. And they've been hunting you since? 3 days now, she confirmed. I made it to Aspen yesterday, thinking I could get help from the law, not knowing Holloway was already there, the moment he saw me. She touched her wounded arm. Well, you know the rest. They fell silent again as Wyatt guided Midnight up a steeper trail, climbing higher into the mountains. By midday, they had reached a vantage point where they could see for miles, including the road to Carbondale winding through the valley below. We'll rest here a while, Wyatt decided, dismounting and helping Julia down. Her legs were unsteady from hours of riding, and she stumbled slightly against him. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Wyatt found himself noticing the flecks of gold in her green eyes before he stepped back, clearing his throat. Midnight needs water and we should eat something, he said, reaching for his saddlebag. There's a spring just over that rise. They sat in the shade of a large pine, sharing jerky and hardtack from Wyatt's provisions. Julia ate sparingly, her gaze repeatedly drawn to the valley below. How long to Carbondale? She asked. If we push hard, we can be there by nightfall, Wyatt replied. Stage comes through tomorrow morning. Julia nodded, then turned to look at him directly. Why are you helping me, Mr. Grimes? You could have left me to fend for myself. Most would have. Wyatt stared out at the horizon, uncomfortable with her direct question. Told you I don't like Thornton or Holloway much. Is that the only reason? He met her gaze then, something in her voice compelling honesty. Maybe I'm tired of looking the other way. Or maybe I'm just fool enough to help a woman in trouble. To his surprise, a small smile curved her lips. Whatever your reason, I'm grateful, truly grateful. She reached out, her hand resting briefly on his arm. Thank you, Wyatt. The sound of his first name on her lips and the genuine warmth in her eyes stirred something long dormant in his chest. Before he could respond, however, the distant sound of hoofbeats reached them. Wyatt was on his feet instantly, moving to the edge of their vantage point with his spyglass. Below, on the trail they had followed earlier, 5 riders were visible, their progress steady and purposeful. Holloway and Thornton's men, he confirmed grimly. They're tracking us. Julia joined him, her expression tightening as she saw the riders. How did they find us so quickly? Holloway grew up in these mountains. He knows every trail, every shortcut. Wyatt collapsed the spyglass, his mind racing through options. We need to move. Different route than I planned, but we can still make Carbondale by dark if we hurry. As they mounted up again, Julia asked, What will you do once we reach Carbondale, after I'm on the stage? The question caught Wyatt off guard. He hadn't thought that far ahead, focused only on the immediate goal of getting her safely to the next town. Move on, I suppose, he said finally. That's what I do. Julia said nothing more as they set off, but Wyatt could feel her thoughtfulness in the way she held herself against him, slightly more distant than before. It bothered him, though he couldn't say why. They took a more difficult trail, one that required them to dismount at times to lead Midnight over rocky terrain. It was slower going, but it offered better cover and was less likely to be the first choice for their pursuers. As the afternoon wore on, dark clouds began to gather over the mountains, the air growing heavy with the promise of a storm. By the time they reached a small plateau with a view of the valley leading to Carbondale, the first drops of rain were falling. "There's a line shack about a mile ahead," Wyatt said, eyeing the darkening sky with concern. "Trappers use it in winter, but it should be empty now. We can wait out the worst of the storm there." Julia nodded, pulling her coat tighter around her as the rain intensified. By the time they reached the crude log structure, they were both soaked through, the mountain storm having unleashed its full fury upon them. The shack was simple one room with a small fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a single narrow bed, but it was dry and secure. Wyatt checked it thoroughly before bringing Julia and Midnight inside. There was no stable, but the shack was large enough to accommodate the horse in one corner, away from the fire. "Get those wet clothes near the fire," Wyatt instructed as he worked to start a blaze with the dry wood stacked beside the hearth. "I've got a spare shirt in my pack you can use while yours dries." Julia hesitated only briefly before accepting the offered shirt, her practical nature overriding modesty in the face of necessity. She disappeared behind a hanging blanket in one corner while Wyatt tended the fire, trying not to think about her changing just a few feet away. When she emerged, his shirt hung large on her frame, reaching almost to her knees, but she had managed to make it look almost proper, belting it at the waist with a length of cord. Her wet hair, freed from its pins, fell in damp waves past her shoulders, catching the firelight in strands of gold and amber. Wyatt looked away quickly, busying himself with checking his guns. "Storm's getting worse," he commented, nodding toward the window where rain lashed against the glass. "Might be here a while." "Will that delay our pursuers as well?" Julia asked, settling carefully on the edge of the bed. "It should," Wyatt confirmed. "Even Holloway won't track well in this weather." A comfortable silence fell between them as the fire crackled and the rain drummed on the roof. Wyatt found himself studying Julia when she wasn't looking, the graceful line of her neck, the determined set of her chin, the way her fingers absently traced the edges of her father's journal, which she kept always within reach. "Tell me about your father," he found himself saying, surprising them both. Julia looked up, a flicker of grief crossing her features before a small smile took its place. "He was a good man. Stubborn like me, but fair. He believed in working hard and treating others with respect." She paused, her smile growing sad. "He lost my mother when I was 10, influenza, but he never let his grief make him bitter. He taught me everything, reading, mathematics, even how to shoot a rifle." "Unusual lessons for a daughter," Wyatt observed. "He said knowledge never hurt anyone and being able to defend yourself was just practical," Julia replied with a hint of pride. "He wanted me to go to college in Denver, but I couldn't bear to leave him alone, so I stayed, kept house, helped with his records." Her voice caught. "He was so excited about the silver vein he'd found, said it would set us up for life, that I could finally go to school if I wanted." The pain in her voice stirred memories in Wyatt of his own family, of dreams he'd once had before they were shattered by violence. Before he realized what he was doing, he'd moved to sit beside her, their shoulders almost touching. "My father was a rancher," he said quietly. "Down in Texas. Had a small spread, nothing fancy, but it was ours. He taught me and my brother how to ride, rope, shoot. Taught us to stand up for what's right, too." Julia turned to him, surprised by this voluntary sharing of his past. "What happened to him?" "Your family?" Wyatt stared into the fire, his jaw tightening. "Raid, 10 years ago, cattle thieves who didn't want to leave witnesses." He fell silent, the old pain washing over him anew. "I was out checking fence lines, came back to find them all gone. Parents, brother, sister?" "I'm so sorry, Wyatt," Julia whispered, her hand coming to rest on his arm. The gentleness of her touch nearly undid him. "Been on my own since," he continued, the words coming easier now. "Tracked down the men who did it. After that, bounty hunting seemed like a natural fit. Been doing it ever since." "And is it?" Satisfying, this life, Wyatt considered her question, realizing no one had ever asked him that before. It's a living, he said finally. But satisfying? No, I wouldn't say that. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, of shared loss and resilience. Without thinking, Wyatt reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering on the softness of her cheek. Julia's breath caught, but she didn't pull away. For a long moment, they remained frozen in that tentative connection, the storm raging outside while something equally powerful stirred within. It was Julia who finally broke the spell, lowering her eyes. "We should rest," she said softly. "Tomorrow will be difficult." Wyatt withdrew his hand, nodding in agreement. "You take the bed, I'll keep watch." "You need rest too," she protested. "The bed is small, but I'll be fine by the fire," Wyatt interrupted, moving back to his position near the hearth. "Get some sleep, Julia. I'll wake you if anything changes." She looked as though she might argue further, but instead nodded, slipping beneath the rough blanket on the narrow bed. "Good night, Wyatt, and thank you for everything." "Good night," he replied, turning his attention to the window where rain still pounded against the glass. But long after Julia's breathing had deepened into sleep, Wyatt remained awake, his thoughts in turmoil. This woman had somehow breached the walls he'd built around himself over the past decade. Her courage, her determination, the way she looked at him with genuine gratitude, it all stirred feelings he'd thought long dead. And that terrified him more than any gun-toting outlaw ever could. The storm broke sometime in the night, leaving a world washed clean and gleaming in the early morning light. Wyatt had dozed intermittently, always with one hand near his gun, but the night had passed without incident. Now, as dawn painted the eastern sky with streaks of gold and pink, he stepped outside to survey their surroundings. The air was crisp and sweet with the scent of pine and wet earth. From the plateau where the shack stood, he could see all the way to the valley below and beyond it, the distant rooftops of Carbondale. No sign of pursuit, but that didn't mean Halloway and his men weren't still searching. The soft sound of the door opening behind him announced Julia's presence before her voice did. "It's beautiful," she said, coming to stand beside him. She had changed back into her own clothes, now dry from a night by the fire, and had braided her hair into a simple plait that hung over one shoulder. "That it is," Wyatt agreed, though he found his eyes drawn to her profile rather than the landscape. In the clear morning light, she looked younger, the worry lines that had marked her face the day before momentarily eased. "How's your arm?" he asked, noticing she moved it more freely. "Better," she replied with a small smile. "Your doctoring skills are quite good for a bounty hunter." "Picked up a few things over the years," he said with a shrug. "When you spend as much time away from towns as I do, you learn to take care of yourself." Julia studied him for a moment, her head tilted slightly. "You're not what I expected, Wyatt Grimes. What did you expect?" "I'm not sure," she admitted. "When I burst into that saloon desperate for help, I thought anyone who agreed would do it for money or other reasons." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "But you're different. You're helping me because it's right, aren't you?" Despite all your efforts to seem otherwise. Wyatt shifted uncomfortably under her perceptive gaze. "We should get moving. Still a few hours to Carbondale, and I'd like to get there well before dark." Julia didn't press, but the knowing look in her eyes suggested she had her answer anyway. They packed up quickly, Wyatt erasing all signs of their presence from the shack, while Julia prepared a simple breakfast from their remaining provisions. The trail down from the plateau was treacherous after the rain, forcing them to go slowly, leading Midnight on foot for the steepest sections. By mid-morning, however, they had reached more level ground, and Wyatt judged it safe enough to mount up and continue at a better pace. As they rode, Wyatt found himself unusually talkative, pointing out landmarks and sharing bits of knowledge about the terrain and wildlife. Julia listened attentively, asking questions that revealed her quick intelligence and genuine interest. It had been years since Wyatt had engaged in such easy conversation with anyone, and he found himself enjoying it despite the circumstances. "Have you ever been to Denver?" Julia asked as they forded a shallow stream, the water sparkling in the midday sun. "Once or twice," Wyatt replied. "Big city. Getting bigger every year with the railroad bringing more folks west. I've never been," she admitted. Father described it as exciting but overwhelming. "I wonder if I'll find it so." There was something in her tone that made Wyatt glance down at her. "You're worried about what comes after, aren't you? After you deliver the evidence." Julia nodded, her expression sobering. "I have no home to return to, no family left. I have some money Father was careful about saving but starting over completely." She trailed off, then squared her shoulders. "But I'll manage, I always do." Her resilience struck him anew. This woman who had lost everything yet remained determined to see justice done, to build a new life from the ashes of the old. It resonated with something deep within him, a path he might have taken himself if grief and rage hadn't consumed him after losing his own family. "You will," he agreed softly. "And the lawyer in Denver, he'll help make sure Thornton pays for what he did." "I hope so," Julia said, though doubt tinged her voice. "Men like Thornton have money and influence. They don't often face consequences for their actions." "This time will be different," Wyatt found himself promising. "Your father's journal, the deed, their evidence, and your testimony." "The word of one woman against a powerful man and a sheriff," Julia shook her head. "I'm not naive, Wyatt. I know the odds." They rode in silence for a time, Wyatt turning over her words in his mind. She was right, of course. Even with documentation, her fight for justice would be uphill, possibly dangerous. Thornton wouldn't stop hunting her just because she reached Denver. The thought of her facing that alone troubled him more than he wanted to admit. By mid-afternoon, they were within a few miles of Carbondale. Wyatt guided Midnight off the main trail to a secluded spot where they could rest and observe the approaches to town. No sign of pursuit yet, but caution had kept him alive this long. "We'll wait until dusk," he decided, helping Julia dismount. "Less eyes about then. The stage office will be closed, but I know the manager. He can sell you a ticket for morning and point us to safe lodging for the night." Julia stretched, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at her injured arm. "And you? What will you do after I'm safely on that stage?" The question hung between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. Wyatt had been asking himself the same thing all day and still had no clear answer. "I haven't decided," he said honestly. "Had a bounty I was planning to pursue down south, but—" He shrugged, leaving the thought unfinished. Julia studied him for a long moment, then stepped closer, her hand coming to rest lightly on his arm. "Come with me," she said softly. Wyatt stared at her, caught off guard by the directness of her request. "To Denver," she nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "Help me see this through, Wyatt. I'd feel safer with you there." The admission clearly cost her some pride, this woman who had survived 3 days of pursuit on her own before he entered the picture, and that made it all the more powerful. "Julia," the distant crack of a rifle interrupted whatever he might have said, the bullet splintering bark from a tree just feet away. Wyatt reacted instantly, pulling Julia down behind a fallen log as more shots followed. "Stay down," he ordered, drawing his revolver as he scanned the tree line. There a flash of movement about 200 yards back. "How did they find us?" Julia gasped, keeping low as Wyatt had instructed. "Must have guessed we'd head for Carbondale," Wyatt replied grimly. "Looks like 3, maybe 4 of them trying to circle around and cut us off from town." He fired twice, not aiming to hit but to force their attackers to take cover, buying time. "We need to move. Stay low, head for those rocks to the right. I'll cover you." Julia nodded, her face pale but determined. At Wyatt's signal, she darted toward the shelter of the rock formation while he laid down covering fire. Once she was safely behind the rocks, he followed, bullets kicking up dirt at his heels. "They're between us and Carbondale now," he panted, pressing his back against the cool stone. "We'll have to circle wide, try to come in from the north instead." Will we make it before dark? Julia asked, her voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. Wyatt checked his ammunition, mentally calculating distances and times. It'll be close, but we need to move now while they think they have us pinned. He took a moment to study her face, finding fear there but also trust in him to get her through this. It strengthened his resolve like nothing else could have. Stay right behind me, he instructed. When I move, you move. When I stop, you stop. Understand? Julia nodded, gripping her father's journal tightly to her chest. I understand. What followed was a tense game of cat and mouse through the wooded foothills. Wyatt led them in a circuitous route, sometimes doubling back, sometimes waiting motionless for long minutes as their pursuers passed nearby. Midnight followed obediently, his training as a hunting mount proving invaluable as he moved quietly through the underbrush. The sun was sinking toward the western peaks by the time they reached the northern approach to Carbondale. The small town lay spread out below them, its buildings casting long shadows in the late afternoon light. From their vantage point, Wyatt could see movement at the southern edge of town riders, moving with purpose. Holloway's sent men ahead, he observed grimly. They'll be watching the stage office and the hotels. What do we do now? Julia asked, fatigue evident in the slump of her shoulders. Wyatt considered their options, his mind racing. There's a small ranch just outside town belongs to a man named Cooper. He and I have done business before. He might be willing to shelter us for the night, help get you on that stage come morning. Can we trust him? He has no love for Thornton, lost part of his water rights in a dispute last year. Wyatt turned to her, his expression serious. It's a risk, but less of one than trying to slip into town with Holloway's men watching every corner. Julia straightened, summoning her remaining strength. Then let's try it. I trust your judgment, Wyatt. Those words, simple but profound in their faith, warmed something in Wyatt's chest that had been cold for years. He helped her mount Midnight once more, then swung up behind her, guiding the tired horse down a narrow trail that would lead them to Cooper's ranch without passing through town. The Cooper ranch came into view just as the last light was fading from the sky, a modest spread with a main house, barn, and a few outbuildings. Smoke rose from the chimney, and lamplight glowed in the windows, signaling the family was home. Wyatt approached cautiously, alert for any sign that Holloway's men had been here ahead of them. But the ranch seemed peaceful, a dog barking to announce their arrival the only disruption to the evening quiet. Thomas Cooper himself emerged onto the porch, rifle in hand, as they rode into the yard. He was a man in his 50s, weathered by years of hard work, with shrewd eyes that narrowed as he recognized Wyatt. Grimes, he called, lowering the rifle slightly. Didn't expect to see you again so soon. Evening, Cooper, Wyatt replied, dismounting and helping Julia down. Need a word if you've got time. Cooper's gaze shifted to Julia, taking in her tired appearance and the careful way she held her injured arm. Something in his expression softened slightly. Come on in then, he said, stepping back to allow them entry. Martha's just put supper on. Inside, the Cooper home was warm and inviting, smelling of fresh bread and beef stew. Martha Cooper, a kind-faced woman with silver threading her dark hair, took one look at Julia and immediately ushered her to a chair at the table. You poor dear, you look exhausted, she clucked, pouring a cup of hot coffee and placing it in front of Julia. Thomas, who are these folks? While Cooper introduced them, Wyatt took a moment to peer out the window, ensuring they hadn't been followed. Satisfied, he joined the others at the table, briefly explaining their situation while omitting certain details for safety's sake. Thornton's men, you say? Cooper's expression darkened. That snake's been causing trouble all over the county. Bought the judge in Aspen last year, which is how he got my water rights. Sheriff Holloway's working with him, Wyatt added. They've got men in Carbondale now watching for us. Miss Owens needs to be on the morning stage to Denver, but you need somewhere safe for the night, Cooper finished, exchanging a glance with his wife. And you thought of us. There was a moment of tense silence before Martha spoke up firmly. "Of course they'll stay, Thomas. We can put them in the back room. No one would think to look here." Cooper nodded slowly. "Martha's right. You're welcome to stay, both of you. I've got no love for Thornton or his schemes." Relief washed over Julia's face. "Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Cooper. We won't forget your kindness." "No need for thanks," Martha said, bustling to serve them each a bowl of stew. "Any enemy of Elias Thornton is a friend of ours. Now eat up, both of you. You look like you could use a good meal." Over supper, Cooper provided valuable information about the town's current state. Holloway had indeed sent men ahead, 4 deputies who were checking all arrivals and departures. The morning stage was scheduled for 8 o'clock and would be watched closely. But, Cooper added with a slight smile, the stage has to stop at the Henderson place on the North Road to pick up mail. If you were there waiting, the driver wouldn't have any reason not to let you board. The Henderson place is abandoned, Martha explained to Julia. Old Man Henderson passed last winter, but the stage still stops there for mail from the outlying ranches. Wyatt nodded thoughtfully. "That could work. We'd need to be there early before Holloway's men think to watch it." "I can ride out with you at first light," Cooper offered. "Make it look like we're just heading out to check cattle, get you there safely, then double back." Plans were made over the remainder of the meal, with Martha insisting that Julia take a hot bath afterward to soothe her tired muscles and clean her wound properly. Wyatt found himself steered to the barn to tend to midnight, with Cooper accompanying him. "That's quite a woman you've got there, Grimes," Cooper commented as they settled the horse for the night. "Never thought I'd see you riding with a lady." "It's not like that," Wyatt replied automatically, though the denial felt hollow even to his own ears. "She needed help, that's all." Cooper gave him a knowing look. "If you say so, but a man doesn't risk his neck against odds like these for just help, not in my experience." Wyatt had no response to that, busying himself with Midnight's saddle instead. Cooper was too perceptive by half, seeing what Wyatt himself was only beginning to acknowledge that Julia Owens had come to mean something to him. Something more significant than any connection he'd allowed himself in years. When they returned to the house, Martha had shown Julia to the small back bedroom and provided her with a clean nightgown. Wyatt would sleep in the main room, near the door where he could keep watch. As Cooper banked the fire for the night, Martha pulled Wyatt aside. "That girl has been through hell, Mr. Grimes," she said quietly. "But there's strength in her, the kind that doesn't break easily." "I know," Wyatt replied, his voice equally low. Martha studied his face, then nodded as if confirming something to herself. "Good. She'll need that strength for what's ahead. And she'll need someone who understands it, too." Before Wyatt could respond, Julia emerged from the back room, her damp hair loose around her shoulders, the borrowed nightgown covered by a shawl Martha had provided. She looked younger, somehow, the simple domestic setting contrasting sharply with the danger they had faced throughout the day. "I wanted to say good night," she said, her eyes finding Wyatt's across the room, "and to thank you again, all of you, for your help." "Get some rest," Wyatt told her, unable to look away from the softness in her expression. "We leave at first light." Julia nodded, hesitating as if there was more she wanted to say before turning back toward the bedroom. At the door, she paused, looking over her shoulder at him. "Good night, Wyatt." "Good night, Julia," he replied, the words carrying more weight than they should have, long after the Coopers had retired and the house had fallen silent. Wyatt sat by the window, keeping watch as he'd promised. But his thoughts weren't focused on potential threats. Outside, they were turned inward, grappling with feelings he'd thought himself incapable of after so many years of solitude. In just 2 days, Julia had awakened something in him that he'd believed long dead. Her courage, her gratitude, the way she looked at him like he was worthy of trust and respect, it all combined to create a pull he couldn't deny, a connection he hadn't sought but couldn't regret. As dawn approached, bringing with it the final leg of their journey together, Wyatt faced a decision that would shape whatever future remained to him. Would he see her safely onto that stage and ride away, back to the lonely existence he'd carved out for himself? Or would he take the risk she had offered to accompany her to Denver, to see this through to the end? The answer, when it came to him in those quiet pre-dawn hours, was both surprising and inevitable. For the first time in a decade, Wyatt Grimes was choosing to follow something other than the cold trail of justice or the promise of a bounty. He was choosing to follow his heart. Dawn brought a light mist that cloaked the landscape in ethereal white, providing natural cover for their departure. Cooper was ready with horses, and Martha pressed packages of food into Julia's hands with firm instructions to eat properly on the journey. The older woman then surprised Julia with a warm embrace. "You stay strong, dear," Martha whispered, "and keep that man of yours close. He's a good one, underneath all that gruff." Julia's cheeks colored, but she didn't correct the assumption, simply returning the embrace with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Cooper." Wyatt, meanwhile, was checking his weapons one final time and securing their few belongings to Midnight's saddle. The plan was simple. Cooper would lead them on a roundabout route to the Henderson place, arriving well ahead of the stage. There, Julia would wait to board while Wyatt kept watch for any sign of Holloway's men. "Once she's on that stage, what then?" Cooper asked quietly as they prepared to mount up. "You heading back this way?" Wyatt's eyes found Julia across the yard, noting how the morning light caught in her hair, turning it to liquid gold. "No," he said, the decision feeling right as he spoke it aloud. "I'm going with her to Denver." Cooper nodded, a knowing smile tugging at his weathered features. "Thought you might." "Safe travels, then, to both of you." They set out as the first rays of sunlight broke through the mist, riding northward across Cooper's land before cutting east toward the main road where the Henderson place stood. The abandoned homestead came into view around 7 o'clock, a small cabin with a sagging porch and an overgrown garden, situated near the road where the stage would pass. Cooper helped them secure Midnight in the old stable behind the house, where the horse wouldn't be visible from the road. "Stage should be along in about an hour," he said, checking his pocket watch. "I'll head back now, draw any attention away from this direction." "We're in your debt, Cooper," Wyatt said, offering his hand. The older man shook it firmly. "No debt between friends, Grimes. Just see that justice is done for that girl's father. Men like Thornton have gotten away with too much for too long." After Cooper departed, Wyatt and Julia settled in to wait, positioning themselves inside the cabin where they could watch the road without being seen. The interior was dusty and sparse, with only a few pieces of furniture remaining from its former occupants. Julia sat on an old wooden chair, her father's journal in her lap, her expression pensive. "What will happen when we reach Denver?" she asked quietly. "After I speak with Father's lawyer." Wyatt leaned against the window frame, his eyes scanning the empty road. "If the evidence is strong enough, they'll send marshals to arrest Thornton and Holloway. There'll likely be a trial. And if it's not strong enough," the question hung heavy in the air. Wyatt turned to look at her directly. "Then we find another way, but those men will answer for what they did, Julia, I promise you that." She studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face. "We," she repeated softly. "You've decided to come with me then?" "If you still want me to," he replied, suddenly uncertain. A smile broke across her face, transforming her features with a warmth that reached all the way to her eyes. "I do," she said simply, "very much." The honesty in her voice stirred that unfamiliar feeling in his chest again, a warmth. A lightness that had no place in the life he'd been living but felt utterly right in this moment, with her. Before he could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats drew his attention back to the window. His hand moved instinctively to his gun, but he relaxed slightly as he made out the approaching stagecoach, right on schedule. "It's time," he said, turning back to Julia. "Remember, once you're on that stage, keep your head down, don't draw attention, I'll be right behind you the whole way." Julia nodded, gathering her few belongings and tucking her father's journal securely inside her coat. She moved toward the door, then stopped, turning back to face Wyatt with sudden resolve in her expression. "Before we go," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I need to tell you something." Wyatt waited, watching as she gathered her thoughts. "When we first met, when you helped me escape from Aspen, I thanked you," she began. "And I saw something in your face, surprise, maybe even discomfort, as if gratitude was foreign to you." She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "I've watched you these past days, Wyatt. The way you protect without seeking praise, the way you help without expecting thanks. And I've realized that perhaps no one has properly valued what you give so freely." Her words struck him deeply, exposing truths he'd never acknowledged even to himself. How long had it been since anyone had truly seen him as more than a gun for hire, a dangerous man best kept at a distance? "Julia, you don't have to, I do," she interrupted gently, closing the distance between them until she stood directly before him. "Thank you, Wyatt Grimes. Not just for saving my life, but for restoring my faith that good men still exist in this world. That kindness can be found even in the most unexpected places." And then, before he could respond, she rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his, a kiss so gentle and yet so powerful that it seemed to stop time itself. Wyatt froze for only a heartbeat before his arms came around her, drawing her closer as he returned the kiss with all the emotion he'd been holding back. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, the stage was pulling up outside, the driver calling out for any passengers or mail. "We should go," Julia whispered, though she made no move to step away from him. Wyatt nodded, reluctantly releasing her but keeping one of her hands in his. "Together," he said, the word a promise. Her smile was answer enough as they moved to the door, ready to face whatever came next, not as protector and protected, but as equals bound by something neither had expected to find on this dangerous journey. The stage ride to Denver was long and grueling, the rough roads making every mile a test of endurance. 6 other passengers shared the cramped interior with them, creating a natural shield for Julia, who kept her bonnet pulled low and her conversation minimal. Wyatt had secured a seat next to her, his body positioned to block her from the view of anyone who might glance in through the windows at stops. They faced one tense moment in a small town called Eagle, where 2 of Holloway's deputies were questioning arriving passengers. But the driver, perhaps sensing their urgency to remain unnoticed, had claimed a broken axle that needed immediate repair, directing all passengers to the local hotel while he tended to it. The delay worked in their favor, allowing them to slip away to a small cafe while the deputies focused their attention on the hotel. "How much further to Denver?" Julia asked quietly as they shared a simple meal, their first proper food since leaving the Cooper Ranch. "Another day's journey," Wyatt replied, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "We'll reach it by tomorrow evening if there are no more delays." Julia nodded, fatigue evident in the shadows beneath her eyes despite her determined expression. The past week had taken its toll, physically and emotionally, yet she remained steadfast in her purpose. Wyatt found himself increasingly in awe of her resilience, her quiet strength in the face of overwhelming odds. When they reboarded the stage several hours later, the deputies were gone, presumably having continued their search elsewhere. The remainder of the journey passed without incident, the Colorado landscape gradually transforming from rugged mountains to the more settled terrain of the foothills approaching Denver. As promised, they reached the city as evening fell the following day, the lights of Denver spreading out before them in a dazzling display that spoke of civilization and progress. Julia gazed out the window with wide eyes, taking in the brick buildings, the gaslights, the bustling activity that continued even as darkness descended. "It's so much bigger than I imagined," she murmured as the stage rolled down the main street toward the depot. Wyatt, who had visited the city several times, saw it anew through her eyes, not just as another stop on his endless wanderings, but as a place of possibility, of new beginnings. "We'll find a hotel for the night," he said, helping her down from the stage as it came to a halt. "First thing tomorrow, We'll locate your father's lawyer." They secured rooms at a modest hotel near the depot, separate rooms, though adjacent, at Wyatt's insistence on propriety despite the closeness that had developed between them. Julia was too exhausted to argue, practically swaying on her feet as the desk clerk handed over the keys. "Get some rest," Wyatt told her softly as they reached her door. "I'll be right next door if you need anything." Julia looked up at him, her eyes filled with emotions too complex to name. "Thank you," she said simply, the same reverence in her voice that had first caught his attention days ago in that Aspen saloon. This time, instead of discomfort, Wyatt felt a warmth spread through him at her gratitude. Before he could think better of it, he leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Sleep well, Julia," he murmured, reluctantly stepping back. "Tomorrow we begin setting things right." Morning brought clear skies and renewed determination. After a hearty breakfast that did much to restore Julia's energy, they set out for the offices of Harrison and Prescott, the law firm where her father's attorney, James Harrison, kept practice. The firm occupied the second floor of a handsome brick building in the business district, its offices speaking of success and respectability. The clerk at the front desk, a young man with spectacles and a serious demeanor, looked up as they entered. "May I help you?" he inquired politely. "I need to see Mr. Harrison," Julia replied, stepping forward with more confidence than Wyatt had seen from her since their journey began. "My name is Julia Owens. I believe he was my father's attorney." Recognition flickered in the clerk's eyes. "Miss Owens, Marcus Owens's daughter." At her nod, he continued, "Mr. Harrison has been quite concerned about your whereabouts, miss. There were telegrams from Aspen about your father's passing. Please follow me. He'll want to see you immediately." They were ushered into a spacious office where James Harrison, a distinguished gentleman in his 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes, rose from his desk in surprise. "Miss Owens, thank God you're safe," he exclaimed, coming around to greet them. "I received word of your father's death last week, but no one could tell me what had become of you. I feared the worst." "It nearly was the worst, Mr. Harrison," Julia replied soberly. "If not for Mr. Grimes here, I wouldn't have made it to Denver alive." Harrison's attention shifted to Wyatt, assessing the tall, weathered man with the careful eye of someone accustomed to reading people. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him as he extended his hand. "Then it appears I owe you a debt of gratitude, Mr. Grimes. Please, both of you, sit down." "Tell me everything." Over the next hour, Julia recounted the events of the past week: her father's murder, her escape with the deed and journal, the pursuit by Holloway and Thornton's men, and their journey to Denver. Harrison listened intently, occasionally jotting notes, his expression growing increasingly grave. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "This is a serious matter, Miss Owens. Murder, corruption, theft of property rights, these are federal crimes, particularly when they involve a local law enforcement officer." "You believe me then?" Julia asked, a hint of vulnerability breaking through her composed facade. "Without question," Harrison assured her. "Your father and I were friends as well as business associates. He wrote to me about Thornton's attempts to buy his claim, about his concerns regarding the sheriff's allegiances." He gestured to a file on his desk. "I have copies of some documentation here, but what you've brought, particularly your father's journal and your eyewitness account, is the evidence needed to bring these men to justice." "What happens now?" Wyatt asked, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the office. Harrison considered the question carefully. "I will take this information to the federal marshal's office today. Given the severity of the crimes and the involvement of local law enforcement, I believe they will dispatch marshals to Aspen immediately to arrest Thornton and Holloway." "And Julia?" Wyatt pressed, his primary concern her continued safety. "Miss Owens should remain in Denver under protection until the arrests are made," Harrison replied. "She will need to provide formal testimony, of course, but that can wait until the accused are in custody." Julia nodded, accepting this assessment, though Wyatt noted the slight tremor in her hands as she clutched her father's journal. The reality of what lay ahead, the formal statements, the potential trial, having to face her father's killers again, was settling in. Harrison seemed to notice her distress as well. "You've been through an ordeal, Miss Owens. What you need now is rest and security. I would be honored if you would consider staying with my wife and me until this matter is resolved. We have a comfortable home and Ellen would welcome the company." The offer was generous and would provide Julia with the protection she needed, but Wyatt felt an unexpected pang at the thought of her being somewhere he couldn't ensure her safety personally. Before either could respond, Harrison continued, addressing Wyatt directly. "And you, Mr. Grimes? Will you be remaining in Denver?" The question hung in the air, weighted with implications. Wyatt glanced at Julia, finding her watching him with an expression of carefully controlled hope. "For a time," he answered finally. "At least until I know Miss Owens is safe and justice has been served." Something like relief crossed Julia's features, and Harrison nodded, seeming satisfied with the response. "Very well. I suggest you both return to your hotel and rest while I set things in motion with the marshal's office. I'll send word once I have news of their plans." As they left the law offices and stepped back onto the busy Denver street, Wyatt felt a curious mixture of emotions. Relief that they had reached their destination safely, that Julia's story was believed and action would be taken. But also uncertainty about what came next for both of them. "Do you think it will work?" Julia asked quietly as they walked back toward their hotel. "Will they really be brought to justice?" Wyatt considered her question seriously. "Harrison seems confident and federal marshals don't take kindly to corrupt sheriffs. I believe there's a good chance, yes." She nodded, appearing to take comfort in his assessment. They walked in comfortable silence for a time, both lost in their own thoughts, before Julia spoke again. "Will you really stay, in Denver, I mean, until it's over?" There was vulnerability in the question that touched something deep within him. Wyatt stopped walking, turning to face her directly in the middle of the sidewalk, heedless of the people moving around them. "I said I would," he replied simply. "I don't make promises lightly, Julia." Her eyes searched his, looking for reassurance beyond his words. "And after, when it's over and justice has been served, what then, Wyatt?" It was the question he'd been asking himself since that moment in the lined shack, when she'd kissed him a kiss that had awakened possibilities he'd thought forever closed to him. The future he'd envisioned for years solitary, moving from town to town, bounty to bounty, suddenly seemed hollow compared to the potential of a life with this woman beside him. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "For 10 years I've lived one day at a time, never thinking beyond the next job, the next town. But now—" He paused, gathering his courage. "Now I find myself wanting something different, something more." Hope bloomed in Julia's eyes, transforming her face with a radiance that took his breath away. "So do I," she whispered. "Something I never thought I'd find in the midst of all this tragedy and loss." Impulsively, Wyatt reached for her hand, linking their fingers together in full view of passers-by. "Then maybe we can figure it out together. When this is over." Her smile was answer enough as she squeezed his hand in return, a silent promise passing between them as they continued toward the hotel, side by side in a city full of possibilities neither had dared imagine just days before. True to his word, Harrison moved quickly. By that evening, a telegram arrived at their hotel confirming that federal marshals would depart for Aspen the following morning, with warrants for the arrest of Elias Thornton and Sheriff Halloway on charges of murder, corruption, and land fraud. "It will likely take several days for them to make the arrests and return to Denver," Harrison explained when he visited them later to discuss next steps. "During that time, Miss Owens, I must insist you remain under protection. My offer of hospitality still stands." Julia glanced at Wyatt before responding. "I appreciate your generosity, Mr. Harrison, but I would prefer to remain at the hotel for now. Mr. Grimes has kept me safe this far, and I trust him to continue doing so." Harrison raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. As you wish. However, I would ask that you limit your movements around the city. Thornton has connections even here in Denver, and word travels fast. After Harrison departed, Wyatt and Julia shared a quiet dinner in the hotel's restaurant, both acutely aware that they had reached a pause in their urgent flight, a moment to breathe, to reflect, and to consider what might come next. What was your life like before all this? Wyatt found himself asking as they lingered over coffee. Julia looked surprised by the question, then thoughtful. Simple, I suppose. I kept house for my father, helped with his record keeping, read whatever books I could get my hands on. A small smile touched her lips. I used to dream of adventures, of seeing more of the world than just our little cabin and the town. Ironic that when adventure finally found me, it came in such a terrible form. Not all of it was terrible, Wyatt suggested quietly, his eyes meeting hers across the table. Her smile deepened. No, not all of it. The days that followed settled into an unexpectedly peaceful rhythm. While they remained cautious, avoiding public places where they might be noticed, they found ways to enjoy the relative safety of Denver. Wyatt showed Julia parts of the city he thought she might appreciate: a small bookshop tucked away on a side street, a park where they could walk among trees and forget for a moment the dangers that had brought them there. In these quieter moments, they began to know each other beyond the crisis that had thrown them together. Julia told him of her dreams to perhaps become a teacher someday, to use the education her father had ensured she received despite their remote location. Wyatt found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone about his family in Texas, about the young man he'd been before grief and vengeance hardened him. "You were studying to be a lawyer?" Julia asked in surprise when he revealed this long-abandoned aspiration. Wyatt nodded, somewhat embarrassed by the admission. "For a time, my father thought it important that at least one of his children get an education beyond the ranch. My brother was better with the cattle anyway." "You would have made a good lawyer," she said thoughtfully. "You have a strong sense of justice." "Maybe once," he replied, his expression sobering. "But the law failed my family when it mattered most. The men who killed them were never brought to justice, not through legal channels anyway." Understanding dawned in Julia's eyes. "That's why you became a bounty hunter, to find justice outside the law." "To find them," Wyatt corrected quietly. "Justice came after, but it didn't bring my family back, didn't fill the emptiness their loss left behind." Julia's hand found his, her touch warm and reassuring. "Nothing can do that," she said softly. "But emptiness doesn't have to be forever, Wyatt. There's room for something new, something different." Her words settled into him, a truth he was only beginning to accept. The emptiness he'd carried for a decade was still there, but alongside it now was something else: a warmth, a possibility, a future he hadn't allowed himself to imagine until she entered his life. On the 5th day, a telegram arrived from the marshals in Aspen. Thornton had been arrested without incident, but Sheriff Holloway had resisted, resulting in a shootout that left him wounded but alive. Both men were in custody and would be transported to Denver within the week. "It's really happening," Julia said that evening as they stood on the small balcony outside her hotel room, watching the city lights come alive in the dusk. "They're going to face justice for what they did to my father." "Yes," Wyatt agreed, seeing the mix of relief and grief in her profile. "Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished, Julia. Not many would have had the courage to do what you did." She turned to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I couldn't have done it without you, Wyatt. I want you to know that, whatever happens next, whatever we decide." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "These days with you have meant more to me than I can express." Wyatt stepped closer, drawn by the emotion in her voice and her eyes. All his life, he'd been a man of action rather than words, finding it easier to express himself through deeds than sentiment. But now, facing this woman who had somehow broken through every defense he'd built around his heart, he found words he'd never thought to speak. "Before you, Julia, I was just existing. Moving from place to place, job to job, never connecting, never staying." I thought that was all there was left for me after losing my family." He reached up, his calloused fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "But you changed that. The way you looked at me from that first day like I was worth something beyond the gun at my hip. The way you thanked me like what I did mattered." Julia's eyes widened at his words, her hand coming up to cover his. "It did matter. You matter, Wyatt, more than I think you realize." "I'm starting to understand that," he said quietly, "because of you." In the fading light, with the sounds of the city a distant backdrop to the moment unfolding between them, Wyatt Grimes did something he'd never thought possible. He opened his heart fully to another person for the first time in 10 long years. "I love you, Julia Owens," he said simply, the words feeling both terrifying and right. "I don't know what kind of future I can offer, what kind of man I can be after all these years of hardness, but if you'll have me, I want to find out. Together." Tears spilled down Julia's cheeks now, but her smile was radiant through them. "I love you too, Wyatt, and the future doesn't frighten me as long as you're in it." When he kissed her this time, it wasn't born of impulse or the heightened emotions of danger, but of a conscious choice, a choice to embrace life again, to believe in possibilities beyond the narrow existence he'd confined himself to for so long. The day the marshals returned to Denver with their prisoners dawned clear and cool, the first hint of autumn in the air. Wyatt and Julia had been summoned to the federal building where formal statements would be taken and charges officially filed. "Are you ready for this?" Wyatt asked as they prepared to leave the hotel. Julia smoothed her dress, a new one she'd purchased during their stay, more suitable for the formal proceedings ahead, and squared her shoulders. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. The federal building was imposing, its stone facade a statement of law and order in the growing city. Inside, they were met by Harrison and escorted to a large office where several officials waited, including the chief marshal for the Colorado Territory. "Miss Owens, Mr. Grimes," the marshal greeted them, his handshake firm. "I'm Marshal Edwards. I want to personally thank you for your courage in bringing this matter forward. Corruption of the kind you've exposed undermines everything we're trying to build out here." The following hours were grueling, as Julia recounted every detail of what she had witnessed and experienced, her father's journal providing crucial corroboration of her testimony. Wyatt gave his own statement regarding the pursuit and the actions of Sheriff Halloway and his deputies. "Will we have to see them, Thornton and Halloway?" Julia asked when they had finished, her composure finally showing cracks after the emotional ordeal of reliving her father's murder. "Not today," Marshal Edwards assured her. "They're being held separately and will be arraigned tomorrow. The trial will likely be scheduled for next month, at which point you will need to testify in open court." Julia nodded, accepting this with quiet dignity. "And my father's claim, what happens to it now?" "The deed you preserved proves your ownership as his heir," Harrison interjected. "Once the fraud charges are proven, your rights to the property will be fully restored. You'll be free to work the claim yourself or sell it, as you choose." This news brought visible relief to Julia's features. Not for the value of the claim itself, Wyatt knew, but for the vindication it represented, proof that her father had been right all along, that his life's work would not be stolen by the men who took his life. As they left the federal building late that afternoon, a sense of completion hung in the air between them. The first phase of their journey was ending justice was in motion, the immediate danger past. What remained was the question of what came next. "Walk with me," Julia asked, gesturing toward a small park across the street rather than the direction of their hotel. Wyatt nodded, offering his arm as they crossed the busy thoroughfare. The park was quiet at this hour, most city dwellers already heading home for the evening. They found a bench beneath a large oak tree, its leaves just beginning to turn with the changing season. "I've been thinking," Julia began after they had sat in companionable silence for a time, "about the claim, about Denver, about everything." Wyatt waited, giving her space to gather her thoughts. I don't want to go back to Aspen, she continued. Too many painful memories, but I don't want to sell the claim either, not immediately. It was my father's dream, his future. I owe it to him to make something of it. That's understandable, Wyatt said carefully. Wondering where her thoughts were leading, Julia turned to face him directly, her expression earnest. Harrison says I could hire a manager to oversee the mining operations while I remain in Denver. The proceeds would allow me to perhaps continue my education, maybe even attend the new women's college they're establishing here. That sounds like a good plan, Wyatt offered, still uncertain of his place in this future she was envisioning. She must have sensed his uncertainty, for her hand found his, fingers intertwining with familiar ease. But none of it matters if you're not with me, Wyatt. I meant what I said. I love you. I want a future with you, whatever that looks like. Relief and joy mingled in his chest at her words. I love you too, he replied, still marveling at how naturally the phrase came to him now, after just days of allowing himself to feel it. But Julia, my life has been so different from yours. I've been a bounty hunter, a gunslinger. I'm not sure I know how to be anything else. You were studying law once, she reminded him gently. You could again if you wanted, or something else entirely. Denver is growing. There are opportunities here for a man with your skills and intelligence. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating to settle in one place, to build something lasting, to become the man he might have been if grief hadn't derailed his life a decade ago. Whatever I do, he said slowly, wherever I go from here, I want it to be with you, Julia. You've reminded me what it means to truly live, not just survive. I don't want to lose that again. Her smile was like sunrise breaking across her face. Then don't, she said simply. Stay with me, build something new with me, marry me, Wyatt Grimes. The directness of her proposal startled a laugh from him, a sound so foreign to his own ears that it momentarily surprised him. But the joy behind it was genuine, welling up from a place he'd thought long dead. Aren't I supposed to be the one asking that question? He teased gently. Julia's eyes sparkled with mischief and love. Perhaps, but I've never been very patient when it comes to something I truly want. Wyatt reached into his pocket, fingers closing around a small object he'd purchased days ago in a moment of hope and courage. In that case, he said, drawing out a simple gold ring, I'd better give you this before you completely upend tradition. Julia's breath caught as he held out the ring, its modest diamond catching the late afternoon light. Wyatt. Julia Owens, he said, his voice low and serious despite the smile he couldn't quite suppress. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of helping me remember how to live again every day for the rest of our lives? Yes, she whispered, tears of joy making her eyes shine as he slipped the ring onto her finger. 1,000 times yes. Their kiss sealed the promise, witnessed only by the changing leaves above, and the distant sounds of a city that would become their home, a place to build the future neither had dared to imagine before fate and circumstance brought them together. The trial of Elias Thornton and former Sheriff Holloway became something of a sensation in Denver. The story of corruption, murder, and a daughter's brave quest for justice captured public imagination, and the courtroom was packed each day as testimony was given and evidence presented. Julia faced her father's killers with remarkable composure, her testimony clear and unwavering despite the visible hatred in Thornton's eyes. Wyatt remained by her side throughout, his steady presence a source of strength when memories threatened to overwhelm her. When the verdict came guilty on all counts, with sentences of hanging for Holloway and life imprisonment for Thornton, the justice they had sought was finally, irrevocably achieved. Marcus Owens could rest in peace, his murder avenged through the law rather than violence. It's truly over, Julia said that evening as they walked arm in arm through the city streets, the weight of the past months lifted from her shoulders. Father can rest now, knowing the men who took his life will never harm another. Wyatt nodded, understanding the complex mix of relief, grief, and closure she must be feeling. Your father would be proud of the strength you've shown, Julia. I know I am. She leaned into him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. What happens now feels almost strange. For so long this has been our purpose, justice for my father, now that it's accomplished. Now we look forward, Wyatt finished for her. We build that future we've been talking about, and build it they did, with a determination equal to that which had brought them together. They were married in a small ceremony at Harrison's home 2 months later, with the lawyer and his wife standing as witnesses. Julia wore a simple gown of ivory silk, her honey gold hair adorned with flowers, and Wyatt found himself struck speechless by her beauty as she walked toward him to say their vows. "I never thought I'd find this kind of happiness again," he confessed to her that night as they lay together in the small but comfortable house they had purchased on the outskirts of Denver. "After I lost my family, I believed that part of my life was over forever." Julia propped herself up on one elbow, her hair falling like a curtain around them as she gazed down at him. "Sometimes life gives us second chances if we're brave enough to take them," she said softly, before leaning down to kiss him. In the months and years that followed, they built a life neither had imagined possible when they first met in that Aspen saloon. Wyatt, with Harrison's encouragement, resumed his legal studies and eventually joined the older man's practice, finding that his years as a bounty hunter had given him unique insights into the workings of justice and human nature. Julia, true to her word, continued her education at the women's college, eventually becoming a teacher at a school for girls that emphasized not just traditional subjects, but also the practical knowledge women would need in the changing Western territories. The silver mine, managed by a capable engineer they hired on Harrison's recommendation, proved as valuable as Marcus Owens had believed. The income it provided allowed them to live comfortably and to contribute to causes they believed in, including an orphanage for children who, like Wyatt, had lost their families to the violence that sometimes still plagued the frontier. 2 years after their marriage, their first child was born, a son they named Marcus, after Julia's father. He had Wyatt's dark hair but Julia's intelligent green eyes, and from his earliest days showed a curious mind and gentle spirit that delighted them both. A daughter followed 3 years later, Emily, named for the sister Wyatt had lost. She was fair like her mother but had her father's quiet intensity, watching the world with serious eyes before breaking into smiles that could light up a room. "They're growing so fast," Julia remarked one evening as they sat on the porch of their home, watching 6-year-old Marcus teaching 3-year-old Emily how to catch fireflies in the twilight. "Sometimes I can hardly believe how much our lives have changed in such a short time." Wyatt followed her gaze, his heart full at the sight of his children, a family he'd never thought to have after the losses of his youth. 8 years, he mused, taking her hand in his. 8 years since you burst into that saloon and changed everything." Julia smiled at the memory, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I was terrified that day, desperate. I had no idea if you would help me or turn me over to Holloway." "I almost didn't," Wyatt admitted. "I was so determined to stay uninvolved, to keep to myself." "What changed your mind?" she asked, though they had discussed this many times over the years. Wyatt's answer was always the same, but no less true for the repetition. "The way you looked at me when I agreed to help. The way you thanked me, like what I was doing was something sacred, not just a transaction." No one had ever looked at me that way before. Julia turned her face up to his, her eyes still holding that same reverence after all these years. "Because it was sacred to me, Wyatt. You saved more than just my life that day. You saved my hope, my future. You gave me back the belief that good still existed in the world." He leaned down to kiss her softly, still marveling at the twist of fate that had brought this extraordinary woman into his life when he least expected it. "And you," he murmured against her lips, "taught a hard man how to be kind again, how to love again." As their children's laughter rang out across the yard, and the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the Colorado sky, Wyatt Grimes reflected on the journey that had brought him here from a grief-stricken young man bent on vengeance, to a lonely bounty hunter stranger to kindness, to a husband, father, and respected member of the community. It had begun with a single act of help offered to a desperate woman, with gratitude given so genuinely it penetrated the armor around his heart. And it had grown into this a life fuller and richer than he could have imagined, built on love, respect, and the second chance they had given each other. "Papa, Mama, look what Emily caught," Marcus called excitedly, running toward the porch with his sister toddling behind him, her small hands cupped carefully around a glowing firefly. As Wyatt and Julia rose to meet their children, to share in their wonder and joy, he sent up a silent prayer of thanks for the twist of fate that had led him to that Aspen saloon 8 years ago, and for the woman who had taught him that even in the hardest heart, kindness could take root and flourish if given half a chance.